Going to start in a moment. Hi, good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's class. Remember to visit us at BN, that stands for B'nai Noach Academy, bnacademy.org. If you have any questions, please, even during the class, send them to Ask Me. It's one word, Ask Me at TorahQuestions.com. Ask Me at TorahQuestions.com. So tonight's topic is the sin of Cain and Abel, or Cain and Hevel in Hebrew. Now, what are we doing here? In other words, let's just refresh our memory from last few classes we had. Last class, we spoke about the sin of the tree of knowledge. We spoke about, what it's really about, what it means, and the ramifications of it in our lives. Now, I want to focus in, first of all, in general, this whole topic of sin, of doing felonious acts, and what does it say to us? First, I want to begin by something very interesting. Typically, the common word for sin in Hebrew is chet. Okay, now like I know in Spanish it's very similar, not so much in English, but in many of the main languages, especially if they're based on Latin, Greek, and in this case, of course, in Hebrew, which is the original language, the first language of the world, words come from a root. Even if they end up meaning something, so to speak, they evolve to mean something a little different, but you can trace it back, especially a good linguist, somebody who really studies language can trace it back. When the word chet is associated with sin, we have to examine what is the true, so to speak, original meaning of the word chet. And it comes out that what it really means is deficient, lacking. And if you really think about it, it's very well associated with sin. What is sin? Sin means that there's something deficient. Either, very obviously, a person was not able to contain their temptation. There's something deficient in their willpower, deficient in their, ability to control themselves. Even if someone, let's say, for example, I'm just going to use now an extreme example, but it's still an example and a very good one. In the Torah, we find, and this is in association with the Jew, somebody who killed by accident, unintentionally. They killed by unintentionally, no intention. Guy's climbing up a ladder, and somebody happened to be passing by, and he fell off, or something, a pail fell, a hammer fell, and hit him in the head. No intention. I don't even know the guy. Yet, the Torah mandates for a Jew, and again, I'm using this as an example, the Torah mandates that they go into exile. And for the rest of their lives almost, or until the high priest passes, they have to be in exile. And the question is why? The guy did it by accident. No evil intent whatsoever. Didn't even know the person to have any whatsoever vendetta against that person. Why would they have to do it? The answer is chet. This is a sin. There's something deficient, obviously, in one's soul, in one's being. Somewhere maybe even in the very deep, that through me, meaning the person who did it, through him, was able to come such a terrible result, the loss of life of a human being, the loss of the soul. That needs atonement. And essentially, what is atonement? Atonement really, and again, the Hebrew word for atonement is what? The Hebrew word for atonement is kapara, which really comes from the root, which means to cleanse, to wipe away. Thus, when you have a chet, when you have a sin, meaning when there's a deficiency, either deficiency in character or deficiency in ability or deficiency in willpower, or think about it in a sense, carelessness is also a certain type of deficiency. You weren't careful enough, you didn't care enough to take the proper precautions in a scenario like that, and so on. That needs to be atoned. That needs to be wiped away. That's a blemish. That's a scar. That's a terrible stain that needs to be cleansed. So it's important when we approach the concept of sin and what happened, because we do find, right, when you start off humanity in the Torah, what was the first thing? One of the first major events? Adam and Eve sin. The next major event, you think, okay, finally, let's get over it. We learned a lesson. Cain and Abel, what happens? There's some competition. There is discord. There is jealousy. And that leads to the worst sin possible, the ending of a human life. And in the case of Abel, we learned something very powerful, that it wasn't just that one human life that was severed. It wasn't just that one person that was killed. But in fact, when God came to him and says to him, where's your brother? Remember, what did he do? He behaved arrogantly. And he was like, oh, am I my brother's keeper? But then when God says to him, let's stop playing monkey business here. Let's cut that all out. This is what God says to him, I hear the bloods. He says a plural, the bloods of your brother crying out to me from the ground. What does that mean, the bloods? Plural, the blood. You only have one system of blood in every body. No, the answer is, as the sages explain, bloods in plural. Because God said it's not only him that you killed, it's all the future generations, all the potential future offspring that he would have, that they would have, on and on and on for generations. You have now stopped that from becoming possible. So when we talk about sin, we're talking about deficiency. Something is wrong. Obviously, it can sometimes have terrible ramifications. Sometimes we have a little deficiency. It might be not so good. I wouldn't even use the term bad for us personally. But then here you can see, as you see in the case of Cain and Abel, that his deficiency was so bad that it had an everlasting effect, if you think about it, until the end of time. Because it's now cut off that whole offspring stream that could have potentially been there generation after generation from Hevel, from his brother Abel. And that certainly requires an atonement. That certainly is something that needs to be cleansed. So now we're going to get into, now that we have a little appreciation of what's the idea of sin, we can understand that when we learn in the Torah about the sins that happened, again, to remind ourselves, the Torah is not just telling us juicy stories so we keep on reading, so we can sell more Bibles. It's not just trying to fill it up with real, tabloid headlines. It's not certainly just trying to point a negative finger on, oh, look at those people, look how bad they are. There is no purpose in that. There would be no productive reason to do that, and then the Torah wouldn't do that. We know that the Torah refrains from speaking negatively about anything and about anyone, even as we find, we're going to learn about it later, at a later class, in the Parsha of Noach, in association with the flood. The Torah is very, very careful about even depicting animals in a negative light. How much more so human beings? Mm-hmm. So it leads us to the conclusion, which is the obvious one, that when the Torah does give us a negative account, it does give us, some juicy details about a terrible, terrible episode in our history of mankind. It's not for the purpose of pointing a negative finger at anyone. It's not for the purpose of putting anyone down. It's not a purpose of filling up, pages with juicy stories to keep us reading, but rather it is to teach us a lesson. And in fact, the virtue of the fact that we are reading it, that it was put out there for us to read, means that it has a connection to each and every one of us. Now, I ask you, me, I wouldn't kill a person. I have no intention of killing anyone, right? So how would that, for example, apply to me? How in any way would that be relevant to my life? Where do I find myself in that story? So let's examine it. But let's start first, take another step back for a second and take a look. If you really look at I'll call it the first three sins, you find them to be the actual cardinal sins in Judaism. And in fact, for everyone. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the fact that in Judaism they're considered the cardinal sins, that in itself tells us how severe they are. These are the major sins. What are they? The first sin was what? Associated with what? What was the first sin? The tree of knowledge. But what really was the catalyst of the first sin? You remember the snake, the serpent. He was tempted. He desired Eve. And that's what the Midrash tells us. And he really, what his objection, why did he orchestrate this whole thing? What was his problem? What did he want to achieve with this? He was the closest to a human being that an animal can be. In fact, the sages tell us, and I think we discussed them in the previous class, that he was so advanced that he was literally almost, if I may, like the bridge over between a human being and an animal. And he was designated as the servant of the human being. In fact, it's hard to imagine today a snake, but the serpent walked on 2 feet and spoke. So just try to picture him in a nice vest with a bow tie, serving, champagne to the people. He was there to be the, so to speak, the liaison for the human being and take care of his needs and deal with things. But it got to his head, and he had somewhat of a, let's call it, of a human character in him. He was given something. He was a very interesting, like a hybrid almost, if I may. But because he was an animal at the end of the day, he wasn't able to contain it. And it says that he actually desired Chava, and he coveted her. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what did he do? He figured, if I get Adam out of the way, right? Adam was the one who got the commandment. So if Adam gets killed, I'm good to go. She's a free woman. So the first sin is essentially associated with what? Adultery. The second sin, as we're going to learn now, Cain and Abel. What is that? It's obvious. Homicide, murder. Mm-hmm. The third sin that we find in the Torah, as we'll also again discuss at a later time, is the sin of idolatry. It says, then the people started to call in the name of gods, if you recall. So these 3 sins actually, for a Jew, it says that if a Jew is put to task and given a choice, life or death, either you transgress, let's say a particular commandment in the Torah, you commit a certain sin, or we'll put you to death. Except for these 3. And barring the fact that it's not being done intentionally in public, the Jew, if it's to eat on Yom Kippur, if it's to eat something not kosher, if it's a desecrated Shabbat, a Jew does not have to give his life up for it. In fact, he's not allowed to. Those are not so serious and severe that one should give their life up for. These 3, someone puts a gun to someone's head and says, listen, if you shoot him, then I won't shoot you. Or if you don't shoot him, I'll shoot you. You're not allowed to kill another person to save your own skin. If the person's threatening you, that's a whole different category. Someone puts a gun to someone's head and says, sleep with this woman, she's a married woman, or what have you, you're not allowed to. Someone threatens someone's life with, go bow down to an idol, go worship an idol, denounce your belief in God, you're not allowed to. Doesn't matter even if it costs you your life. So we see these 3 sins are like the origin of sin. They are the foundation of all sin, and that's why they are so severe. They are so serious that there is no, even for the ultimate good cause of saving your life, there is no committing the sin. That's how severe it is. So it tells us that this is like the origin of sin. This is the foundation. This is the root of sin. If we actually think about it, we'll find that there's one, I think you mentioned it, there is the common thread in all 3 of them. And that's what really applies to us, because I don't think any one of us, hopefully not, is looking to commit adultery, idolatry, homicide, God forbid. There's certainly that doesn't even tempt me. But in some, and I call it the refined manner, in some refined way, yes, I got to find it in myself, because we're learning about it. We're being told about it. And if you find the common thread, you know what it is? Me. It's all about me. And you said it, it's the ego. Now, some might say, ego, I'm not arrogant. Yes, but ego doesn't always present itself. Doesn't always present itself in a manner that's outright arrogant. In fact, if you speak to a good psychologist, you will find out that one who has a very low self-esteem is also self-centered. Because they're most of the time, if not all the time, thinking about themselves. So there's something in common there. Both are unhealthy. The arrogant and the very low self-esteem both have a thing where they're always occupied with what? With themselves. Likewise, a person who's prone to temptation, or I should say, not just prone to temptation, but falls for it, and a person who's not able to control their instincts and all their desires, again, it's about me, me, me. So it feels good in the moment. It just feels good right here, right now, without giving much thought to the ramifications of what's going to be. So let's zoom in now on the particular sin that we started off with, Cain and Abel. Where do you see the me, me, me in it? Where do you see the self-interest, the ego? It's interesting, and this is perhaps a very little known fact. Not too many people actually are very aware of this. In the verses, what does it seem? In the verses, when you read the story, you read the narrative as to what happened, it seems that there was something about a conflict, a religious conflict, or something of the nature of serving God, where he, seemed to be more desirable by God because his offering was accepted. You recall this, and Cain's wasn't. Well, that was a jealousy. It was a lot deeper than that. There was more to that. It wasn't just that. Because if it's just that, you think about it at a certain level, like, man, what's wrong with you? Really, for that, you're going to kill someone? Well, the truth is that we do live in times, and we do have enough examples in history where, yes, see people even in the name of religion or in the name of service of a higher power went ahead and killed, others, and worse than just killed others, but tortured others, massacred others, and pillaged, and did terrible, terrible things, all, so to speak, in the name of that. It is true. But it's hard to imagine that on someone who was just, these two brothers, Cain, who was just born to whom? To the two ultimate human beings that were created by Hashem himself, by God himself, his hands. It's just hard to imagine that it was really just that. In other words, there had to be something more to it. And even just that, God spoke to him after that. And God said, listen, if you do better, if you make a better effort, I'm also going to be more, pleasingly accepting your offering. In other words, while you're looking at your brother, look at yourself and see what you can do better. So God did speak to him. Shouldn't that have taken care of business, so to speak? Shouldn't that have resolved the problem? Well, the Midrash is the story behind the story. When you read the Torah, you go through the Torah, the narrative, most of the times you're in the dark. Most details are not there, right? It's a very, very, how should I say it?
Vague.
Very vague, and many times very ambiguous. And, maybe you got, for every one detail that it gives us, it holds back 10 details, literally. So you don't know what's going on. Really, to get the full picture and to get a full and absolute comprehensive understanding, we rely on the Midrash. The Midrash is what was passed down, the oral law, from generation to generation. The Midrash tells us something very powerful. And in fact, it's not just something that you have to take, so to speak, at face value and believe it, but you can actually see it hinted in the verses. And it comes out. Think about it. How are we here? How are you and I here? Adam and Eve, okay, so God made a man and a woman. We all know that only a woman can have children. And a man is a man, the male gives seed, and then you have the woman as a child. Mm-hmm. But how, from two sons, do we have the rest of the world? It doesn't say anything about daughters. Mm-hmm. Well, the answer is each of the children, Cain and Abel, was born with a twin. With a twin. And in that stage of things, in that stage of the world, in that stage of time, it was actually allowed by God for one to cohabitate with their own flesh and blood. There was no one else to do it with. Cain was only born with one twin. Abel with two. That already was cause for jealousy. He has more. I know it sounds like, fighting over a woman. It wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. It was, think about it, the fact that he had more. Think how the ego plays. You have what you have. You have your spouse. You have, in a sense, you have a full family. right? I mean, think about it in today's day and age, in today's terms. You got one spouse, and that's a whole family, and you can have a beautiful family from it. Focus on your family. Focus on what you have. Focus on what you could build with this. Focus on what the future can look like from this beautiful union that you have with this person. And then think about it. That's what God gave you. That's what you have. Make the best out of it. What does he do? He looks not at what he has, but he looks at what his brother has. And that makes him feel bad for what he doesn't have. Which again, think about the depth of this. What he doesn't have is not what he really doesn't have. The only reason he believes he doesn't have it is because somebody else does have it. That is a terrible sin. That is, again, going back to the ego. What does the ego do? What does really the ego do? Even if you have a little, okay, we do need a little healthy measure of ego. Yeah, we need to have a self-esteem, but that's not a bad ego. You need to be happy with yourself. Yes, absolutely. You need to feel good about yourself. You need to be proud of your accomplishments because that's a good motivator to want to accomplish more. And you need to enjoy what you have. So then you're motivated to do what? That you want to just sleep on a park bench. That you want to have a nicer home. You want to be more comfortable. Why not? These are good things. There's nothing wrong with them. But the moment you start looking at someone else, what that person has, and therefore that triggers in you this morbidness, this sadness, this feeling of deficiency of what I don't have, now we have a problem. Now we have the beginning of a terrible decay, which could actually lead to homicide, which in the case of Cain, it did. And think about it. He did really have mostly everything. They own the two worlds. These are the two heirs of the first human beings. There's no one else to compete with them. There's no competing, mega company that's going to come maybe and take over. Mm-hmm. There's no one there that might break into your warehouse and steal your stuff. You're it. There's no other world. Enjoy what you got. Yeah. There's so much to enjoy. There's so much to really relish and have a good life. No, but he has one more than me. I'm sure we can all hear human nature in that. Yeah. And then what happens? I become so sick with my own self. I can no longer enjoy it. The food doesn't taste good. My bed doesn't feel comfortable. My car no longer drives so well. My job's because someone has more than me. That is why this is one of the worst sins. Think about it. When someone kills someone else, whether it's because of jealousy, going to jealous, angry rage, whether it's because the person owes you money, whether it's because the current person did you bad, at any level, unless, of course, the person is actively threatening your life, which, again, I underscore that has nothing to do with this. It's a totally and absolutely separate category. That the Torah says you have not only a right, but in a sense, an obligation to defend yourself. But other than that, a person makes a decision, whether it's first-degree murder, second-degree murder, whatever degree it is, but it is a contemplated and so to speak, I would call it a partisan decision to go ahead and take someone else's life. Where does that come from? Either because I think I'm better than them, or because that person did me wrong, or I'm angry at the person, whatever it is. It's all back to ego. It's all back saying, how can that person did me? If they did me wrong, they don't deserve to exist. It means it's about me. Yeah. I got jealous of them. So by killing that other person, you're going to have more now? That was the mistake. Of course, this also manifests itself and shows how deteriorated a person can be in the spiritual. It manifests itself in the spiritual. Remember, I asked the question, something doesn't seem right here. Just because he had a better offering and it was accepted and God smiled at him and he didn't smile at him, so for that he went crazy. God himself told him how to fix it next time, right? No. It shows us something. When a person becomes poisoned, a person becomes decayed from within with this ego, and thus jealousy and hatred, that can lead to that even the most refined things that there are in life, the most sacred things, become unsacred. And that can actually become a cause for people to kill each other. In other words, the mind can understand that if a person is just stuck in the material, stuck in the mundane, how that, with their ego and therefore jealousy, they can become crazy, they can become poisoned, they can become enraged with nonsense to the point of, God forbid, killing somebody else.
Would you say?
But if that person was more spiritual, that person was more refined, somebody who's engaged with more, so to speak, spiritual stuff, maybe that wouldn't happen. Here we see that each, unfortunately, affects the other. If a person is that way in their, so to speak, material life, in the mundane things, that even in their, God forbid, even in their holy things, even if when it comes to worship of God, to offering to God, they will still bring that poison with them. And that too will become another trigger and another cause, another reason to hurt somebody else. So it's both in the material and in the spiritual.
Yeah.
And that kind of sums up the point I wanted to bring out. You wanted to ask something.
Yeah. You talked about low self-esteem is just as selfish as someone arrogant or egotistical. My question is, if in that low self-esteem, there's this deterioration of the spirit, or deterioration of the spiritual self, that would eventually cause harm to another, would you say that would also be the case to cause harm, to want to cause harm to the self?
Perhaps, yes. And causing harm to oneself, God forbid, if you think about it, is even worse than that. I think that's in a whole other category of itself. I think it kind of, in other words, it metastasizes into something even worse, where it now becomes an issue where the person is so ill, is so mentally ill, or becomes, so to speak, sick, that they're even, so to speak, ready to do harm to themselves. That's terrible. That's terrible. But that, I guess it starts here, and then it kind of deteriorates to that point. So like that's the thing, when you have sometimes, like you see people are, they start off with a certain goal, albeit a bad goal, let's say to hurt someone. And now someone else, let's say, I'm just painting a scenario or hypothetical. Someone steps in and says, hey, put the gun down, right? But the person's become so enraged that it's led them to such a crazy point, and it went from ego to wanting to hurt someone else to now even not caring and becoming reckless about their own safety, because if their mind was functioning properly, if everything was working up here and there was no, I would say, the rage, the bacteria of rage and jealousy just overwhelming the rationale, and they were like, oh, this is not worth it. Let me just put the gun down. I'm not taking a bullet because I'm crazy now, and I might not even hurt that guy, but I'm certain to die. But that all goes out the window. That's not working. That's not functioning. So yes, I agree with you. And sadly, even sometimes a person becomes so overwhelmed. Listen, there is such thing as mental illness, but remember, Cain was not mentally ill. And the proof for it is God has a conversation with him afterwards. And prior to that conversation, Cain is trying to hide. He's trying to this. He's trying to wiggle his way out. He's trying to play smart. He's trying to play wise guy. If you're mentally ill, all that doesn't happen. So he obviously, his rationale was fully functional. But sadly, his rationale was consumed, at least when he did the act, was consumed with what? Not with what's right, what's wrong, or what the ramifications of it. Because you see, afterwards, he becomes, oh, what's going to be with me? How am I going to survive? And God, give me a chance. And he didn't think of all that because he became overwhelmed with the ego and thus with the jealousy. So thank you for that insight, actually. You triggered that insight. And that's really what it's all about. And that's, again, going back to when we speak of sin, in some circles, they say, sin. Let's talk about it. What does it mean? So just to summarize, sin is chait. What is chait? Deficiency. Something's lacking. Something's wrong. And therefore, don't look at the sin itself. That can be, at the end of the day, a result, or I should say a symptom of the real problem. Let's find what the real problem is. What's the deficiency here? It's ego. And that, you see the common thread in all the three cardinal sins, the main sins. It's what I want. It's what I think is good for me. And then in this sin, again, I'm just summarizing what's highlighted and what comes out to the forefront is how it's not even what I'm lacking. It's not even, okay, I want to please myself. I want to be happy. I want to enjoy. I want to have pleasure. I am. Everything's fine. But the moment I see what someone else has more than me, my ego can't tolerate that. And I no longer enjoy even that which I have. So I'm driving a nice new car, but his nice new car is a little more expensive than mine. I lose my whole equilibrium. I become crazy. I become enraged. And now my car feels like I'm sitting on a plank of wood when I'm sitting in this nice plush, upholstered, beautiful seat, and the car is driving great. And I think we can all relate to it because we all have that at some level where we suddenly stop enjoying what we have. We become just everything, just loses its taste and loses its pleasure. And we generally start to suffer, but it all starts over here. The stuff's good. Life's pretty good. Could it be better? We always want better. And remember, I said that in the beginning. We always should strive to do better, whether it's in the material and likewise in the spiritual. There's nothing wrong with that. In other words, God wired us in a way that a healthy human being always wants more. But there's a difference when you want more because you're not happy what you have. Or there's a difference when you want more because you're happy what you have, you appreciate it, you realize, wow, this is good. Imagine if I get a little more. Why not? That's a big difference. So we'll end over here. And if you have any questions, again, as I mentioned, please send the questions to askme@torahquestions.com. And be sure to visit us at bnacademy.org. And looking forward to seeing you again at future classes. So what do you say? Was